When Donald Trump announced his sweeping global tariffs on what he called Liberation Day, markets tumbled and politicians scrambled.
This is CNN Breaking News.
Now we begin with the breaking news from Wall Street. Trading has been underway now for just about 30 minutes. The early assessment, deep concerns.
But amidst the economic chaos, there could be unexpected benefits for the UK. Today, we're going to be exploring how Trump's trade war might actually create opportunities for Britain in ways that many people haven't even considered. On April the 2nd, 2025, President Trump imposed sweeping tariffs across the globe, including a 10% tariff on all UK exports to the US. And while this isn't ideal for British exporters, this rate is significantly better than the 20% imposed on the EU and the massive increase on Chinese goods, with some Chinese products even facing additional tariffs of up to 145%. This is how that currently looks. And although right now there is a 90-day pause on all tariffs exceeding that 10% for all countries bar China, having discussed this topic with several political and economic experts, we felt that this differential treatment has created an interesting dynamic that could potentially benefit the UK in several ways. One of the most immediate potential benefits of British consumers lies in cheaper imports from China and other nations that are heavily impacted by the US tariffs. With Chinese goods facing prohibitively high tariffs of up to an additional 145%, manufacturers are likely to redirect their exports to alternative markets such as the UK, where tariffs remain either lower or even non-existent. This phenomenon is known as goods dumping, and it occurs when exporters sell their products at reduced prices in markets unaffected by trade barriers. For British consumers, this could mean lower prices on items such as electronics, clothing, and even electric vehicles. Professor Stephanie Rickard from the London School of Economics has explained that firms facing these higher US tariffs are now more likely to seek new markets for their goods. For example, with electronics, Chinese manufacturers may offer smartphones and laptops at reduced prices to compete in the UK market. For electric vehicles, Chinese EV makers could even target Britain with competitive pricing. And finally, with clothing, South Asian producers may start to flood the UK market with affordable apparel as they redirect stock away from the US. Professor David Miles from the Office for Budget Responsibility, the OBR, noted that diverted trade could lead to stuff being available in the UK a bit cheaper than it otherwise would have been. This shift could actually ease the cost of living pressures for middle-class British families, whilst also offering access to high-quality goods at lower prices. Major companies like Apple and Samsung might even try to boost sales in markets like the UK as they face pressure from US tariff impacts. Another potential benefit stems from Britain's relatively favourable position compared to other economies facing much higher tariffs, with only a 10% tariff on UK exports to the US compared to a 20% tariff for EU goods and up to an additional 145% for Chinese products. British exporters gain a competitive edge in sectors where they compete directly with these nations. For example, in manufacturing, British-made machinery and equipment could become more attractive to American buyers compared to their EU alternatives. Also, potentially with food and beverages, products like Scotch whisky and British cheeses may see increased demand in the US, particularly due to their lower relative costs. This competitive advantage could be particularly significant in sectors where the UK directly competes with the EU, as British products will suddenly be 10% cheaper relative to the EU alternatives in the American market, potentially allowing UK firms to gain market share and increase exports to the US. Furthermore, this tariff differential could encourage businesses to route products through the UK or invest in UK-based production facilities to take advantage of favourable tariff rates. And while the British Retail Consortium notes that goods specifically routed from China via the UK would face a 34% tariff, genuinely UK-made or UK value-added products would benefit from the lower 10% rate. The third potential benefit lies in the improved prospects for a UK-US trade deal. And while comprehensive free trade agreements typically take years to negotiate, there are encouraging signs that the UK's measured response to Trump's tariffs is yielding diplomatic benefits. Trump told reporters that he believes Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer was very happy on how the UK was treated on the tariffs. Trump also indicated openness to negotiation if countries offered, in his words, something that is so phenomenal. And more recently, The Independent reported on April the 13th that a breakthrough between the UK and US over tariffs could be reached in coming days. In addition to this, Chancellor Rachel Reeves told reporters that we want to secure the best possible deal for British jobs and British industry. And we're absolutely resolved to do everything we can to achieve that. The UK's relatively restrained approach to retaliatory tariffs appears to be beneficial diplomatically. And while the UK government has published a sample list of US goods that could potentially face tariffs, it also emphasised that being on this list doesn't necessarily mean that a product will face tariffs. This measured approach focuses on the negotiation rather than immediate retaliation, and this seems to be keeping the dialogue open. Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds has also stated that while talks are ongoing with the US government to secure an economic deal aimed at avoiding or reducing the tariffs, the UK does reserve the right to take any action that we deem necessary if a deal is not secured. This balanced position gives the UK negotiation leverage without escalating tensions. Here is a list of the top products imported from the US according to the ONS. The strength of the pound also adds another layer of complexity but also opportunity to Britain's position amidst Trump's tariffs. Recently, sterling climbed past the $1.30 mark after surprising GDP growth figures boosted confidence in the UK economy. A strong pound increases purchasing power for imports priced in foreign currencies like dollars or even euros. For British consumers, this means firstly cheaper imports. A stronger pound makes imported goods more affordable, amplifying potential savings from redirected Chinese exports due to US tariffs. Secondly, we have reduced inflationary pressure. Lower costs for imported materials could help businesses to keep prices stable despite global trade disruptions. This might even lead to a reduction in interest rates. However, there are also challenges that need to be considered. First, export competitiveness. A stronger pound does make British goods more expensive overseas, potentially reducing the demand from foreign buyers. And secondly, we have potential trade balance concerns. Increased imports relative to exports could actually widen Britain's trade deficit if sterling remains strong. Overall, sterling's strength could amplify consumer benefits whilst also posing challenges for exporters, making it both an asset but also a hurdle depending on how policymakers manage these dynamics moving forward. The tariff landscape also presents opportunities for increased foreign investment in Britain. Companies facing high reciprocal tariffs, particularly those based in China or Europe, may relocate production activities to the UK as a way of bypassing prohibitive costs when exporting goods to America. For example, automotive manufacturing. European car makers may consider expanding operations in Britain to avoid higher export costs under EU-US tariffs. With consumer goods, Chinese manufacturers might establish production facilities in Britain for easier access to both domestic and American markets. Such investments would create jobs, boost local economies and strengthen Britain's manufacturing base, all whilst positioning the country as an attractive hub for global trade amidst ongoing disruptions. Another advantage lies in Britain's service-heavy export profile. Unlike manufacturing-heavy economies such as Germany or China, 2/3 of UK exports to America consist of services, including finance, insurance, advertising, and consultancy, which are not affected by these tariffs. This exemption provides significant insulation for Britain's economy compared to nations reliant on goods exports. And while indirect impacts may still occur if demand weakens globally, services remain largely shielded from direct tariff effects, thus ensuring continued access to the lucrative American markets. Beyond these major advantages, there are still additional ways that Trump's tariffs could benefit British consumers and businesses. First, we've got emerging market opportunities. As global trade routes shift, British firms may start to find new opportunities in markets previously dominated by US or Chinese exporters. Secondly, we may see a push for domestic manufacturing. The tariff situation might incentivize growth in certain domestic industries where Britain has existing expertise but also faces competition from cheaper imports. And third, we have improved negotiation leverage. With global trade disruptions ongoing, Britain may gain leverage in future negotiations with other partners seeking stability. Despite these potential benefits, it is also important to acknowledge the potential downside. First, UK exporters still face a 10% tariff on goods sold to the US, which could reduce competitiveness and sales. Second, economic growth could be impacted. Oxford Economics predicts that Trump's tariffs will cut UK growth, with GDP growth forecast to fall from 1.5% to around 1% for 2026. Third, domestic industries could be undercut with cheaper imports through goods dumping, particularly in sectors like automotive manufacturing. Fourth, we've got potential job losses in UK export sectors facing US tariffs. And fifth, we've got broader economic uncertainty and market volatility. And sixth, we've got possible inflation increases due to global trade disruption. And seventh, we've got trade policy uncertainty, which could discourage some long-term business investments. So, while Trump's tariffs do present challenges for the global economy, the UK finds itself in a relatively advantageous position compared to many other nations. From potentially cheaper goods through diverted exports, to a competitive edge against heavily tariffed competitors, through to prospects for a more favourable trade agreement with the US, there are reasons for cautious optimism. The key for Britain will be balancing the potential benefit of goods dumping for consumers against the risks to domestic manufacturers, whilst also continuing diplomatic efforts to secure favourable trade agreements. The government's current measured approach does appear to be yielding diplomatic benefits without escalating tensions. As global trade patterns continue to evolve in response to these tariffs, Britain's strategic position with lower tariffs compared to major competitors, a service-heavy export profile, and the ongoing dialogue with the US provides several potential pathways to turn this disruption into a significant opportunity. The coming months will be crucial in determining whether Trump's tariffs ultimately become a burden or a blessing for the UK economy. And what is clear is that in a complex world of international trade, Britain's next moves in this global economics chess game will be pivotal in shaping our economic future. And financial markets will likely be volatile over the coming months. I personally plan to follow the advice from many financial experts and continue to dollar cost average into ETFs to help mitigate the risk whilst also hopefully capturing some upside. If you'd like to understand how the spring statement potentially also impacted the UK's prospects, including potential mortgage rates, watch this video here. Thank you for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please like, subscribe, and also let me know your thoughts in the comment section. Until next time, ta-ra.